So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I am with CMTP. The disclaimer is that I'm not a payer, but we have been doing a lot of work with payers and other stakeholders, so don't shoot the messenger. What CMTP does, if you're not familiar with it, is our focus is improving evidence through a multi-stakeholder process. We want to meaningfully involve all key stakeholders in helping to generate evidence that is reflective of real-world patients and practices and meaningful for decision-making for patients and clinicians, coverage and reimbursement decisions, but also at the same time we don't want to squash innovation. We're looking for ways to bring high-value technologies into the clinical setting as quickly as possible, identify those technologies and get them into the clinical setting. So it just so happens that in this multi-stakeholder process, we've been doing a lot of work in this area of molecular diagnostics and next-generation sequencing, and we've been getting a lot of input from all stakeholders, but it's important for us to bring payers to the table, so we've been really getting a lot of insight into the payer perspective as well, and we try to create recommendations that are useful to payers. So I'll talk more about CMTP's work just a little bit further on in the presentation, but for now, we'll just sort of set up the basic challenge. Obviously, molecular diagnostic tests have the potential to transform oncology. That's why we're all here. But the integration of biomarkers into clinical practice has been a bumpy ride so far. And it's been, frankly, kind of inefficient because a number of reasons. One is, as we'll talk more in a minute, a lack of evidence of clinical utility. And when I use the term, I'm thinking of benefit to patients that has been demonstrated, benefit to patients when a test is used for clinical decision making. A lot of the validity studies are inadequate or flawed. And very importantly, there's a lack of a shared understanding of what kind of evidence is actually needed. I was talking to Dane earlier, and I told him that about a month and a half ago, I was at one of these big NGS-type conferences, and I went to a session that was called Generating Evidence of Clinical Utility, and an academic speaker. There were a lot of academics, a lot of industry people at this conference. The academic speaker made a point of saying that it was very important to their laboratory to develop evidence of clinical utility so that they could get payers to cover their tests. And when she described what they were doing to get that evidence, I didn't hear anything about clinical utility or benefit to patients or clinical studies. And so I put up my troublesome little hand and asked what they were doing to develop evidence of clinical utility for the new tests they were developing. And she said, well, we're doing literature reviews. And I said, but if it's a new test, how much literature really has been published on it? And she said, well, we can't afford to do clinical studies. That's what we're doing. And I said, I'm not sure payers are going to be receptive to that. And the lady next to me leaned over and said, what do payers want? And I think that's, it really speaks to a disconnect in what people who are developing tests maybe think or assume payers want and what payers are really looking for. So that's one of the things that CMTP is trying to address. So, the challenge for payers, I think, has already been articulated well today. The growth in the number and complexity and cost of tests, the fact that we're swimming in new variants that are being discovered all the time and being accumulated in different databases, with the potential downstream consequences of wrong decisions, really serious and uppermost in the mind of payers. And so for payers, closer scrutiny is needed even as these tests proliferate. There are, of course, as many people will point out, sort of a discordance of policies across the payer world. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, including the fact that they serve different patient populations and have different organizational structures and modes of operation. And, you know, they don't all necessarily review the same bodies of evidence when they're doing their policy reviews. I found one review that looked at 10 national payers and the coverage decisions, the coverage policies that they had on the books as of 2012. And there was actually 90% agreement in the decisions that they made for coverage. Of course, that, you know, 10% discordance can be a real problem for test developers, obviously. But it's notable, you know, this review found 49 tests for which there were positive coverage decisions. These are genetic and pharmacogenomic tests out of about 110 that were actually reviewed by payers. And then you set that against sort of the wave of new variants and new tests that we were just talking about on the previous slide. So it's kind of a slow slog, although there are reasons for that. So just very quickly, one of the questions that I was asked to answer is, what are the considerations for coverage that payers have when they're doing these policy reviews? And the first consideration is that the test be medically necessary, which generally means, and we are having to stay at sort of the level of, you know, sort of high-level generalities across payers. We can't get too specific here, but generally that means that the test needs to have a direct impact on clinical care, which typically means something along the lines of, you know, the disease needs to be treatable or preventable. There needs to be sort of a change in patient management that would be taking place as a result of using the test. So that obviously kind of rules out doing tests just to get a diagnosis if the diagnosis isn't then something that can be acted upon, which is a feature of this definition that sometimes frustrates clinicians, but this is true of most payers, I think. But as far as clinical utility goes, many payers would like to see more than evidence that management decisions would change. They want to actually see that outcomes improve for patients when the test is used for that clinical management and in real practice. And payers will ask, you know, what other tools are available for the same kind of function. If there are other tools then that are doing a reasonable job, then you know, it would be reasonable to ask to see sort of a comparison to the tools that already exist. If there are no other tools and there's a serious medical need, then obviously in that situation, you know, that's a reason to consider maybe a lesser standard of evidence, but there still needs to be, you know, some evidence that the test is actionable. Overall, they're looking for a strength of evidence type assessment. They're looking for peer-reviewed studies in national medical journals, and the review paper that I mentioned earlier did an analysis and found that tests that aren't covered tend to lack evidence from prospective randomized clinical trials. So in the past, that has been a pattern. Obviously, reviews of available studies done by groups like ARC or Blue Cross Blue Shield Tech are very important to payers, as well as evidence-based consensus standards, guidelines from groups like NCCN and ASCO. FDA-cleared tests with drug label information are typically persuasive for payers, but not always, and I cite one exception there, and there are other exceptions, but generally speaking, that's an FDA-cleared test with an FDA-approved drug. A companion diagnostic is something that would be covered. Expert clinical opinion and physician practice patterns can be persuasive, particularly when medical need is great and the evidence situation is maybe not as strong as ideal. And it's worth mentioning that when you go through and look at payer policy decisions, typically you don't see any reference to cost effectiveness. That doesn't mean that cost isn't important, but it's not coming into these evidence reviews, generally speaking. So overall, where we are at is that there has been sort of slow uptake by payers in terms of coverage policy decisions for these types of genetic and pharmacogenomic tests because there's a sort of a paucity of published clinical utility data available. People haven't been doing the studies in the past, as well as oftentimes availability of alternative effective screening methods in these clinical spaces that they're looking. Now, it's important to say, this is what's been happening up until now. So that's sort of a snapshot of the past. I do think things are, and I was also asked to just answer the question, what do payers do with off-label prescribing? And I think the question was directed towards test-directed off-label prescribing. And we've had a couple of examples of this type of decision-making and presentations earlier in the day. The idea being that, for example, and I took this example from one of the payer policy websites, melanoma patients with a V600E BRAF mutation benefit from a number of different drugs, and there are FDA-approved drugs that you can use in that situation. So when you find the same mutation in a colon cancer patient, you might be tempted to use one of those drugs to see if it benefits the colon cancer patient. In this particular example, as it turns out, it doesn't. But there are examples of this kind of test-directed decision-making where patients do benefit. Payers are, I think, generally speaking, deeply uncomfortable with this decision-making model right now because you don't know when it's going to work and when it's not going to work, and there's a lot of research that needs to be done to sort those questions out. One payer sort of complained to me, though, that he doesn't know what he's paying for. He's afraid that he's paying for this kind of decision-making. But he's not sure. So that's the answer to that question. Discomfort with test-directed off-label prescribing because the basic sort of rationale many payers don't feel has been validated. But as I started to say, that's sort of what's been happening in the past. I do think that things are beginning to change. And one of the interesting developments that's underway now is a payer based in Michigan called Priority Health that's in the process of developing policies that would include covered next-gen sequencing for specific clinical situations. Many payers in the past have considered next-gen sequencing investigational. And they're going to have some form of coverage for test-directed off-label use of targeted therapies in the context of clinical trials. So this is sort of a de facto coverage with evidence development, similar to the kind of program that Dane was just talking about. And Sean Tunis will be speaking later on this subject as well. But this makes sense. The Affordable Care Act requires coverage for patients in clinical trials, and so since that provision exists anyway, it makes a lot of sense to recognize the possible benefits of multiplex testing by going ahead and providing coverage for this type of situation. So there are sort of changes on the horizon, and I think because this Affordable Care Act policy exists, you may begin to see more payers sort of move in this direction. But there's still this problem with sort of a lack of agreement about what the standards should be, lack of agreement, lack of mutual understanding about what evidence is needed, and there's a whole sort of range of questions that need to be answered about what to do with these new technologies. And this is where hopefully our Green Park Collaborative comes in at CMTP. The work that we've been doing is to develop recommendations for these kinds of situations where there's a need for methodologic standards and a need for better predictability and better consistency in evidence standards through a multi-stakeholder platform that includes patients, regulators, clinicians, payers, life sciences companies, researchers, and some of the people who are here today are people who have been involved in our meetings and our documents, creating recommendations. Last year, we released a study design recommendation document on molecular diagnostics and adult oncology. And again, we used a multi-stakeholder process. The idea here is that these documents, we say analogous to FDA guidance. What we mean by that is just that we're trying to inform what we call the post-regulatory space, meaning after FDA approval, payers are the ones who are now considering it for, in effect, approval. And so what evidence do they need? So that's what analogous to FDA guidance means. But this molecular diagnostics document that we put out last year, I think I'm not going to go into it in detail because I don't have time. But so the key issue that I just want to focus on with this document is that it recognized that randomized controlled trials, yes, are the gold standard, but it also recognized that they're very costly, they take a lot of time to accomplish, and there need to be other good alternatives that have to be sort of sensibly thought through. And so there's a strong emphasis in this document on alternative methods. And I want to emphasize that the document wasn't setting up these methods, wasn't trying to set up a level of evidence type framework. We weren't trying to say this type of study is better quality than this type of study. What we were trying to say is, what situation are you in and what type of study would be appropriate to answer questions of clinical utility for that situation? So we have recommendations for randomized controlled trials, and we go through and talk about study designs that are best for test validation or utility under RCTs. We also talk about prospective, retrospective studies, and in our recommendations, what that means is you've got an established drug that has gone through FDA approval and been through randomized studies for efficacy. After that drug is approved, you develop a biomarker that is predictive of the response to that drug. And if there are stored adequate tissue samples available from the efficacy trials for the drug, then you can go back and validate the marker and test it for clinical utility using those tissue samples and demonstrating the predictive value of the marker. So that's the way we're thinking of prospective, retrospective studies there. If you have that situation and you don't have stored tissue samples, then what we suggested you might consider doing is single-arm studies with non-contemporaneous controls. We also have a recommendation for prospective observational studies, and we spend a lot of time sort of putting the framing around it to make sure that people are taking it seriously, as in, you know, this needs to have as much planning as an RCT would have. You need to prospectively plan your outcome measures. the patient population you're going to be studying, your enrollment criteria, your power calculations. So, you know, we're not, these are high quality observational studies we're talking about. And then finally, we also have recommendations for modeling techniques where maybe there are multiple data sources. You don't have direct evidence of clinical utility, but it's possible to connect the dots to infer patient benefit. So finally, that document created a general framework and suggested some different ways to get evidence of clinical utility for molecular diagnostic tests. But it was really just a beginning. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in this area, particularly with next generation sequencing, because there's a whole series of specific issues that come up with next generation sequencing that we didn't attempt to answer in that earlier document. So we have meetings underway now, and anyone in this room who's interested in participating is welcome to, and this began with a workshop that we held over the summer, and I have workshop summaries with me, so anyone who's interested, I'll be happy to give you a workshop summary because I don't want to carry them home again. We're going to be holding meetings through the winter into the spring. We'll begin recommendation drafting in the spring, and hopefully by early summer have a final set of recommendations. And we're going to be asking questions about the evidence standards. And again, this is a multi-stakeholder process where payers will be involved, industry, clinicians. You know, what do you do with panels? How should these be assessed? How does the assessment change depending on how the panel is designed? I like that transitional idea, Dane, and I was talking with Rich Shilsky just earlier about the same kind of concept, that in between. You know what comes before, you know what comes after. Is there an interim period where maybe we should think about different standards to coax products along until they get to the point that that more evidence can be gathered, and you know, what would be the conditions, what would be the limits, what are the role of case reports? Dane was talking about that too. For what's the appropriate way to integrate case reports with new information, or rather with the existing body of information. And et cetera. You know, so these are examples of the types of questions that we're going to be working on this year. And so, you know, do let me know if you're interested. Feel free to, we've got information on our website about it. And you know, watch for what happens here. Watch this space. I should have put a thank you slide. I didn't, but thank you.